let's talk about Jeff Williams,
Yes.
Mr. Jeff Williams, who everyone thinks he's really a boring character, but he was the number one candidate to be the next CEO when Tim Cook eventually steps down. Jeff Williams, if people don't know, is Apple's chief operating officer, and he announced on Tuesday this week that he's going to be stepping down later this year. Although he's going to be starting to give up some of his duties in July. He has, he's responsible for a whole bunch of things at Apple, overseeing, the all sorts of engineering of the Apple Watch and Apple's sort of sprawling global operations. And so I guess he's got a lot on his plate that he's going to be handing off. For the moment, his position is being filled by Sabi Khan, who is currently the Senior Vice President of Operations, which was Jeff Williams' old job. So Khan has followed him into, his successive roles. So wherever, Jeff Williams has gone, Sabi Khan follows behind him. And these guys actually have worked together along with another candidate, which I'll talk about in a minute. These have been Tim Cook's key lieutenants throughout his whole career at Apple.
My impression of Jeff Williams was always that, if Tim Cook were hit by a bus on his way to Apple Park tomorrow, then Jeff Williams would be the immediate person to step in. But
Wouldn't?
Or no, he would be Jeff Williams would be the new CEO automatically if Tim Cook suddenly dies of a heart attack. But it's never really made a lot of sense to me of Jeff Williams being the long-term replacement CEO, because Jeff Williams is only a few years younger than Tim Cook. Yeah. And Tim Cook is already at retiring age. So, Tim Cook retires next year. Jeff Williams is CEO for 6 months before he starts retiring too. That's never made sense to me.
But when they talk about retiring age, like 60 is the new 40 or whatever, I don't necessarily see Tim Cook retiring until he really wants to. And, I could totally imagine him being there for another 10 years.
Absolutely, yeah. In terms of his, his abilities, yeah, he could definitely be there for 10 years. But he, I think, has ambitions to go into philanthropy.
Oh, really?
And I kind of made that up, but he's said a couple of times that he's interested in giving away his money. And of course, he's quite the activist CEO, in his own quiet way, and has done a lot of progressive things at Apple. And it's hard to tell though, because if he wants to have an impact, his biggest impact is at Apple. And I think sort of stepping away and starting to give away this huge fortune that he's accumulated would be interesting, but probably of lesser impact. The stuff he could do at Apple has a much, getting into green technology, for example. He could do pushing Apple into green initiatives is going to have far more impact than he could do as a private citizen. But then again, maybe he wants to sort of, he's not going to be around forever. Maybe he's interested in looking at the last 10 years, 10, 15 years of his life as a private philanthropist.
So I've always thought that, if you count Jeff Williams out, he might be like the immediate next CEO, but not really the long-term replacement. I've always thought in these discussions that Sabi Khan has been overlooked. Not only because he's, the next rung down in the chain below Jeff Williams, but also he's been there a long time and he hasn't really gotten a lot of attention. There's the famous story of Tim Cook in the meeting and there's a problem with their logistics in China and Tim Cook says, "Why isn't anybody solving this?" And then at the end of the meeting, he turns to one person and says, "Go over there right now." And then he the person gets on a flight with the clothes on his back and flies to China. That was Sabi Khan in that story. And that was 15 years ago, and he's still there. I've always thought that he would be a good candidate until this story broke just earlier this week, and I looked it up. And Sabi Khan also isn't that much younger than either of them. He's 58 already. So,
Right.
I think it's interesting that also illustrates the fact that Apple is a company with a very low staff turnover at the senior executive level. So people tend to have long tenures there. So you do get these, what they say, people who bleed six colors, I believe is one of the phrases. And,
that's a different blog.
And a corollary to that is it's one of those companies that tends to promote from within rather than bringing people from outside. And when they have tried to bring people from outside, and I can think about the previous two executives for retail, it just did not work out well. So Apple, I think, has a fairly unique way of running itself. The businesses are not separate profit centers. It's all one big profit center. And there's lots of things that people come in from the outside and it makes no sense to them the way that Apple works. So at a senior level, you kind of need people that sort of live and breathe the Apple way. The other thing that I find interesting...
That team player ethos.
Yeah, and the candidates that we're talking about here are all, with the exception of, say, John Turnus, we haven't mentioned yet, they're non-product people. These are like operations people. And that I don't think is a mistake either. I think post Steve Jobs, it's been quite a deliberate decision that the leadership are the sort of non-product people. And because if you had an auteur CEO like Steve Jobs, he would want to put his mark on, or she would want to put their mark on the company. And I just don't think that's right for Apple. So I think, I don't think it would have ever worked for Johnny Ive to be the CEO of Apple, because I think there can only be one Steve Jobs for Apple. Not to say Steve Jobs was that unique, but Steve Jobs was unique for Apple as being the sort of founder visionary. And now they have a structured organization to move that vision forward. And I feel like if they brought in a product-oriented CEO, it would inevitably change Apple. And I don't think that's what Apple wants or needs.
That's funny, because people were saying the exact opposite thing when
I know,
Jobs died.
And I don't agree with
them. That's exactly
them.
what they needed. There's definitely going to come from inside for sure. There's no way they're going to bring in an outside candidate. And Apple University, which was Jobs' attempt to sort of inculcate his DNA into the company, run by what's his name, David Ptolemy, I think. He was a Harvard business professor. He's created inside. I think he was there for about a decade. Created this extremely comprehensive internal management training program based upon case studies about how Apple launched the iPod and the iPhone and comes up with products. It's pretty comprehensive, and I think all of the executives go through this. Even I'm not sure how far down the chain it goes. I'm pretty sure all the managers go. I'm sorry, beg your pardon. Almost everybody goes through some kind of Apple University training. And this is sort of to pass down that, Steve Jobs' way of doing things inside the company. And obviously it's been very, very successful. And it's also like Horace Didier, he's a longtime Apple analyst that runs Asimco. He talks about how Apple is one of the world's, one of the business world's few functional organizations. And the functional organization being that it's made up of experts in all their different particular fields, and it organized like the army or the armed forces. That's another example of a big functional organization where you have all these experts that are working together. And like you said, it's not siloed. It's not broken up into different profit centers. It's not, each different part of the organization isn't run for its own benefit. It's run for the entire company's benefit. Everybody works together. So, and this is the kind of thing I think, when they did this last time, they brought in an outside CEO like Gil Amelio, who was heralded at the time as the savior of Apple. He was a turnaround specialist, and he was going to be able to turn Apple around, which actually was kind of true because
he gets a hard rap given that he's responsible for selecting OS X as the next operating system and hiring Steve Jobs. Two pretty good,
right.
That's a good rap sheet for a CEO.
It is, yeah. He's forgiven for that one move. But it definitely was. It wasn't a success. And as you mentioned, Graham, I think that the two high-profile examples of where Apple's brought in an outside executive, Andrew Lawrence and what was his name, Dan Browett.
Yeah.
He was a previous head of retail. I mean, he didn't even last. It was very short, wasn't it? 6 months, I think.
Yeah.
Before he got put out in his ear. So I'll wrap up real quick. I was looking at the other candidates and I thought, well, there's this one person that no one talks about that I think is is worth thinking about, is Deirdre O'Brien, and she's currently the head of Apple HR and the retail stores. She has this dual role. And the interesting thing about her, and she's an Apple veteran, she's been there for 30 years, even longer than Tim Cook. And she, along with, it was Jeff Williams, Sabi Khan, and Deirdre O'Brien. These were Tim Cook's 3 key lieutenants when he was coming up through the ranks himself, and his 3 key lieutenants when he took over as CEO. And the one thing that Deirdre O'Brien, it's interesting about her career is that she has held that job. She was head of operations too. She came up through the operations the same way that Tim Cook did and Jeff Williams did. And so she was previously the head of operations, and then they moved her across to doing the HR stuff and then the retail stores. And the same way that sometimes when Steve Jobs had a tricky position to fill, or there was an opening, he gave it to Tim Cook. So Tim Cook he started out in operations, but then he got sales, and then he got services. So 3 huge areas of the company. And the same thing happened with Deirdre O'Brien. When she was running HR, which is much bigger than it was because of the retail stores. There are so many people to take care of, so many staff. When they needed someone to fill in for retail, Cook layered it onto top of Deirdre O'Brien instead of finding somebody else to take care of it. So there were some interesting parallels there, I thought, with the way that he trusted Deirdre O'Brien. She's obviously one of the key leaders that he has at his disposal, and he trusts her to be able to take on massive new responsibilities, which I thought was interesting. But of course, she has the same problem as all the other people we've been talking about. Age. She's not much younger. She's about. It's never been officially announced, but she's 60, I think. So, she's only got a couple of years, 4 years younger than Tim Cook, and a couple of years younger than Sabi Khan. But anyway, interesting. I think she's had an interesting career there at Apple, and it'll also be in line, I think, with Tim Cook's sort of activist CEO modus operandi. That maybe he would recommend a woman to fulfill this role. That'd be sort of an interesting, I think that's definitely a possibility.
I have a spitball idea. What do we think about Lisa Jackson? She currently heads up a lot of the environmental things at Apple. Like she's always the person who they bring on screen at the keynotes to talk about, Apple 2030, this big environmental goal that they're trying to hit. I've done absolutely no research, but she looks like she's younger than the other two.
Yeah.
I just had this idea just now, but Lisa Jackson, what's our instant reaction to that?
Well, I'd say she has no operations experience. No.
Well, I imagine she must be working rather closely with the operations team if she's trying to, implement Apple 2030.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, for sure. And who knows? I mean, do you need those things? I mean, one of the interesting things too, I think, about when Tim Cook was working under Steve Jobs is that it looked like he was being groomed. If you look at his career afterwards, and you think, oh, okay, well, Jobs, gave him this job and he gave him that job, and he was sort of moved around a little bit in all the organization. He got to be familiar with a lot of different parts of Apple, which, of course, was the thing about Jobs. I think that distinguished him as a CEO. He had his finger in everything.
Yeah.
The advertising, the product development, and that's been pulled back a little bit, with Cook and with subsequent executives. But I think, if you look at Deirdre O'Brien's career, that was the one thing that I noticed too, that she looked like she'd been introduced to all these different parts of the operation, which kind of looked like, possibly a grooming type situation, which Jackson hasn't had. She's been given a few extra jobs, I think, but they've been mostly with in that focus, with the environmental initiatives.
Yeah. I think one of the things that strikes me here is a mistake it's really easy to make is we have this archetype of the Steve Jobs CEO, but Steve Jobs was very exceptional as a CEO, and CEOs are not normally involved in decisions about product or anything like that. And I think Apple under Steve Jobs was a very different company in so many ways to what it is today. But, it was a fraction of the company in terms of turnover and in terms of product complexity. I was thinking about this with WWDC a couple of weeks ago, and all the different sessions, it's overwhelming, the number of sessions. The number of different products and technologies that Apple does now is vast, and it's so different from the company that Steve Jobs headed up with his 4-product matrix. It's a different world now. It's actually, I would say, impossible really for a CEO to perform the Steve Jobs role of, having hands-on decision making on every single product, because there's just too many for any one person to do. This is a company that's 10 times the size or more. And so I think that's something to factor in too. And a CEO job, I don't think it should be fun. This is a job that's about capital allocation as much as anything. This is stuff that we don't really cover in this podcast. So when we're thinking about it, and everyone goes to people like John Turnus because he's a handsome chap that presents things at keynotes. But I mean, he might be the best hardware leader that Apple has ever had, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he's a CEO person. CEOs are actually normally quite boring. That, you know, it's only because we have this Steve Jobs archetype that we have that expectation. So, you know, I think that's why Deirdre O'Brien is an interesting example. I find it hard to imagine her presenting Apple keynotes in the way that Tim Cook and Steve Jobs did.
Well, go back and look at Tim Cook's early keynote
Well, yeah.
presentations. They're awful. I mean, he was absolutely terrified, quite rightly.
He was. But the only reason I can't imagine her doing it is because I've never seen her do it. She's a behind the scenes person. But I don't think there's anything wrong with a CEO being they don't need to be the charismatic leader. They would need to make the tough calls on capital allocation and stuff like that.
I mean, that's not an expectation that we have of literally any other CEO. Like, no one's ever like, the CEO of Walmart doesn't give good keynote. Who is that? We don't even know.
Yeah.
Like, it's kind of an unreasonable expectation that we put on Apple CEO just because, we're Apple fans and we like to watch them. But also a bit of real-time follow-up. Lisa Jackson was born in 1962. So that also doesn't solve that problem.
Yeah.
I don't know, I guess she
Right,
takes good
yeah.
care of herself. So I thought she was younger.
Yeah.